Thank you, everyone, and very good evening to all. We've heard a lot earlier in our preview from our keynote speakers, and we're here to carry on the discussion further on how India and Indonesia can work together to leverage their strength. So we know India and Indonesia are very large economies, have a very large population. Together combined, they comprise around 25% of the global population. It's also a very youthful population with a lot of opportunities there. And I think there's a lot of areas of strengths that India and Indonesia can leverage together. They're also very large open economies. Trade is around 40% of GDP there. There's a lot of opportunities to work together. They share a lot in common. And they also share the Bay of Bengal, which we are here to hear a lot more in this forum, as we've heard earlier, the Blue Horizon. So there's a lot of opportunity there for both India and Indonesia to cooperate together for growth. All right, so Ambassador Chakraborty, just to start off, we heard a lot about your backstory earlier, right? So maybe now we can actually hear the real story, right? I'm pretty sure we're all very excited to hear from you. 2024 is a very special year for India and Indonesia. It marks the 75th year of diplomatic relations between the two countries. And as India's ambassador to Indonesia, we would most certainly like to hear from you what you think the areas of growth are that the two countries can work together, synergize their efforts, and basically begin or turbo the double engine of growth in the Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I quite like this term double engine because in India it has a different connotation where it has a very political connotation where the expectation is that if you have the same party ruling both the center and the state, then there will be growth. But in international relations and in foreign policy, in particular in our context, I think it means, and correct me if I'm wrong, it means that both India and Indonesia are working very closely together. Before I get to specifics, I would just like to mention what the previous speakers have also done. It's important to understand the context. And I would also say that it's difficult to follow after Samir and Dinopati Jalal and Minister Sandiaga because they have very nicely and painted the canvas. So I will have to now look for some space where I can also put my brush to. But the point is that our colonial experiences still define what we are today in this world. And I will give you two examples. One is the reflection in the foreign policy of both India and Indonesia. Indonesia has what is known as free and active foreign policy. And in India, we use the term strategic autonomy. I find remarkable similarity between these two concepts. And as far as economic policy is concerned, we are following what is known in India as Atmanirbhar Bharat or self-reliant India. And the interpretation here or the concept here is of downstreaming, which is basically that Indonesia will not export raw materials unless they are processed to a certain extent. I think both are defined by this idea of self-reliance, of setting up manufacturing, because sadly in our pursuit of growth, we gave up manufacturing, both India and Indonesia. And the COVID taught us very harsh lessons. And I think now both the countries are emphasizing on manufacturing. And I think there we find our synergies. The second point I would like to make is our goals are similar. Indonesia has the goal of EMAS Indonesia, developed Indonesia by 2045. We are looking at developed India by 2047. Again, that relies heavily on creating jobs for our youth, on manufacturing. And I certainly believe it also means more digital Indonesia and more digital India. And again, there the opportunities come to both of us of collaborating in the digital space. And I think lot is happening. Pa Sandiaga mentioned Indonesian companies. And, every day I discover, it's not known much, but every day I discover many companies have very, very organic linkages with companies in India. And together they are building the digital space, both here in Indonesia and in India. Another point I would like to highlight is that we are maritime neighbors. In fact, India is closer to Indonesia than some ASEAN countries. We are only 90 nautical miles. The westernmost point of Indonesia is only 90 nautical miles from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So we are so close, but still, as Samir said, we somehow in the past lost our way a bit, and now we are redefining, reinventing our relationship, and that will happen in many ways by what Pa Sandiaga said in the creative economy space, in tourism, in connectivity. 8 months or 6 months back, we didn't have a single direct flight connecting our two countries, but today we have 3, and we have plans for more flights connecting India and Indonesia. And I think that shows that the economic corridor is booming. People are coming, people are visiting, and business is going on. I would also say that since we occupy the same maritime space, there are issues of maritime security, maritime domain awareness, piracy, safeguarding the sea lanes of communication. The Malacca states runs north of Indonesia, and we have huge interest in this area. And I think that is one area where India and Indonesia is collaborating, and we need to do more to make sure that this space is safe and secure for commerce and for business. I will mention a few specific instances because being ambassador gives me a ringside view of what is happening. And I was just telling Pa Sandiago that even in tourism, it's not only tourists coming to Indonesia. It is also Indian companies investing in Indonesia. For many years, we have had 2 hotels owned by Oberoi in Bali. Everybody knows about that. One in Bali, one in Lombok. But there is a company called Oyo. And I was just messaging their MD, and I just asked him that how many rooms do you manage in Indonesia? And he told me just now in a WhatsApp message, 60,000 rooms. 60,000 rooms, not only in big cities, but in small 2-tier, 3-tier cities are being managed by Oyo. And that creates a lot of jobs here in Indonesia. And they are a silent operator working quietly, but creating value for their partners. And Pa Sandiago said that, he is partnering with them to do more in Indonesia. I will give another example, again, a space where I think we can work together, and that is in renewables. You stop me if I'm exceeding my time, okay? In renewables, and there is a company, I would like to share this example. There's a company called amidst. Now, amidst is not maybe the most appropriate name for a company which is trying to cut down emissions, but it is an acronym of a company called Empath, Mitra, Indica, Tenaga, something, I forget the S. But they are an amazing company. It's a joint venture between a company in India and Indonesian company. And they are going about very, very diligently setting up solar power stations on rooftop of factories. And they finance it. You don't have to pay. And the only assurance you have to give them is that you'll buy the power that they generate on your rooftop. And that power is 30% cheaper than PL and the utility company. And I met the MD recently, and he said, our goal is to they already have 60 megawatt. Their goal is to have 758 megawatt by 2028, in 5 years. And he told me that would be 25% of the installed capacity of solar in Indonesia. Now, if a company can have that kind of dream, I think that is the future for ties between India and Indonesia. I think I'm exceeding my time, but I will just end by saying that, when we are talking of more manufacturing in Indonesia, then again, Indian companies, Indian MSMEs are the partners to look at. And many are coming to Indonesia. And since there are regulations in Indonesia where you do not allow free imports, they are being compelled to set up base in Indonesia. I think this is a very pro-Indonesia policy, and Indian companies are adjusting to it. And they are setting up shop and manufacturing in Indonesia. And I think that will be the road ahead for India-Indonesia cooperation.
That's very exciting to hear that there's several different industries, right, that India and Indonesia can cooperate on, several different themes that we heard there, digital. We also heard the importance of maritime security. Now, if we were to turn to Dr. Sofwan, right? So in terms of leveraging the demographic dividends of the two nations, right? It's a very young population, a very youthful population, if we put it that way. How do you see both India and Indonesia leveraging that youthful demographic, to further this engine of growth and to contribute to the sectors, to themes, and basically to the collaboration between the two nations?
Thank you very much, Amanda. I think it's a great honor for me to be here, and especially because when we are talking about Indonesia and India cooperation, it is always at the very important historical juncture. Bandung has been mentioned, and when Indonesia and India working together, we were in a situation where the international order was shifting, and the role of Indonesia and India in ensuring that transition is peaceful and providing room for the newly independent countries are important. But we must also remember that this is not only about Bandung. Before Bandung, there could be no Bandung if there is no Asia Relations Conference in Delhi in 1947. And there will be no Bandung if there is no Asia Conference in 1949, where India and Burma leads Asians to call for the end of the military aggression by the Dutch to Indonesia. So Bandung is part of the series of initiatives by Indonesia and India. And I think today we are facing similar challenge. The international order is shifting, and there are a lot of uncertainties. And I think it's time for Indonesia and India working together again. Now, go back to the question on how Indonesia can leverage its position. Indonesia and India can leverage its demographic and natural resources and many of its modalities. First, I think it is important to conceptualize what is development first. So in my conceptualization, development is the balancing of four different goals. First is growth. I mean, you mentioned about the double engine of growth, but it is not always about growth. There is also the goal of equality, the goal of sustainability, and the goal of productive power. These different goals are coming from different philosophical, political, economic tradition. Growth is the goal coming from the liberal tradition, which believes efficiency will lead to growth, growth will lead to maximum individual well-beings, in the tradition of Adam Smith and Ricardo. Equality comes from the tradition of socialism, where productive power came from the tradition of nationalist political economy, like List and its variations in different places. Sustainability coming later with the rise of environmental awareness. So I would like to assess the potential of leveraging Indonesia and India cooperation by looking at these four different goals. First, on growth, I think both countries are doing well. India is growing at more than 7%. Indonesia is growing at 5%. So I think both are in a good situation. In terms of equality, both are having a lot of homeworks in Indonesia and India. Geographic challenges are a huge one, and demographic challenges as well. A demographic bonus is the term that we usually use to look at the youth surplus in Indonesia. But if we look at another angle, it is also a demographic issue, because when you have a lot of youth, but with small opportunities, with little opportunities, with lot of issues, there will be a challenge. So we have a lot of homeworks in terms of equality. But I think there are two aspects that Indonesia can learn much from India. First is on sustainability. India is doing energy transition quite well. In 2010, for example, the renewable sources for electricity generation is at 15.2%, and at 2022 it's already over 20%. Indonesia, on the other hand, have a target of 23% in 2025, but now it is still stuck at 13%. So we can learn much from India, which, for example, able to increase the solar energy capacity by 30 times in the last decade. So this is not an easy feat. In Indonesia, solar energy is still pretty much underutilized. The potential is on 207, some estimates on 207 gigawatt, some estimates to 500, so it's quite huge. But now we only have 291 megawatt, still far from the potentials. And India is showing that it can actually be done. So I think in terms of the sustainability goal, a lot of things that Indonesia can learn from India and can work together with India. Not only solar, wind is also an interesting renewable energy to look at. And now, lastly, on the productive power, we see that India is also going ahead of Indonesia with strong industrial capacity, the ability to develop industries. I mean, a lot of Indian industries here. I mean, you just mentioned in the hospitality industry, Oyo, the digital industry. So I think there are a lot of things that Indonesia can also learn on that. So I think in these two goals of sustainability and productive power, Indonesia can learn and work a lot with India. So, however, these four goals must be balanced under the context of global geopolitical and geoeconomic situation. And I think that is also where Indonesia and India can work together. Growth, sustainability, equality, and the ability to maintain strategic autonomy by increasing productive power can only be achieved when we have room for maneuver, when we have the freedom to choose who our partners is, and when trade is not hindered and not dictated by other partners through power. So I think in that sense, it is in the interest of India and Indonesia to work together to ensure that this current uncertainties coming from the shift and the challenge of the global international order can be managed well. Indonesia and India are important power which can ensure that the current uncertainties can be managed into a productive way. Great power rivalry is not the destiny that we cannot avoid. It is time for countries like India and Indonesia rise up and remind both the United States and China that the world is not only about them both. It is not only about the shadow of their rivals. It is about billions of people looking for a better future. Thank you very much.
Really good segue because we've heard a lot about the four areas of growth. As you said, it was thinking about the engine of growth, right? So growth, equality, productivity, and sustainability. So Professor Poppy, as you know, as an expert on geopolitical affairs, on international relations, as we heard, there's an element here where we also have to consider geopolitical elements in terms of growth. So how do you see India-Indonesia working together on geopolitical aspects, areas of focus that both countries should focus on?
Thank you, Amanda, and also Ambassador and distinguished panelists. It is an honor for me to be here. I think responding to your questions, previous speakers and also Pak Dino, Pak Sandi, and also the previous speakers already mentioned some of the challenges regarding geopolitical situation, geoeconomics that probably have to be faced by both India and also Indonesia. Pak Dino mentioned earlier about the increasing fragmented world, and then he also mentioned something related to the competition of resources. Those are some of the geopolitical challenges that have to be considered both by India and Indonesia, especially when they are trying to work together in solving all these challenges. There are some aspects that we also need to consider in this kind of situation. When we are talking about how then India and Indonesia have to propose the area of cooperation, both countries need to consider not only the geopolitical situation, but also the comparative advantage of each of the country. That's very important. And also the foreign policy objectives of these countries. Because by having this kind of understanding, then we can also develop something that can be complementary between these two countries. What sort of like areas, when we also consider the situation with the geopolitical, I think Sofwan mentioned earlier also about the energy transition. One of the biggest challenges that the human kind is currently facing is regarding how then balancing between the need for securing your energy needs and also the climate change responses. What we have done so far in order to secure and also to fulfill our energy needs has to compromise with what we need to be secure regarding the environmental issues. So India and Indonesia can work together on that issue, especially when we propose the idea regarding just transition, because of balancing both of this situation. The other aspect, geopolitical situation, also Sofwan mentioned earlier regarding the rivalry between the US and also the China, regarding the technological rivalry. So India and Indonesia can also have some strategic partnership regarding these issues. We know that India's impressive digital infrastructure, and then one of the aspects that has been discussed so far regarding the technological rivalry is what to be done regarding the new regulations and the global governance in governing the digital transformation. What about the data protection? What about the security, the cyber security and things like that? So that's why in this kind of situation, I think India and Indonesia should put also effort in providing all the kind of the global rules regarding these issues. Another aspect that also area of cooperation that India and Indonesia can also develop, I think it hasn't been mentioned earlier by the previous speakers, is related to medicine and also pharmaceutical industries. We know that one of the biggest challenges here is how to provide the global health. And the COVID-19 has given us a lesson that if we don't have the technology, if we don't have the resources to, protect our people, and also regarding the, vaccine and things like that, we are going to be relying on the advanced economies technology. And then India is a very famous regarding their advance in regard to pharmaceutical industries, and Indonesia is emerging in that kind of situation. Last but not least, we also understand that due to the geopolitical situation, we also have to face the situation where we also need to consider regarding our food security. We're talking about the energy security, we're talking about the climate change, we're talking about the digital transformation, but we cannot forget about the food security. India, Indonesia can do something related to that, and then the geopolitical situation, the tension, whatever happened in some areas in the world would also affect the need and how we make sure about the food security. That's all for me. Thank you, Amanda.
Professor Poppy, that's a very rich insight into areas of strategic cooperation there. Professor Harsh, how do you see the two nations working together to, for a future where India and Indonesia are leaders on the global stage?
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you for having me here. This is already if one can use the word, a decade from hell. There's so much geopolitical contestation and uncertainty that is visible everywhere. And I think if you would have just noticed that all the conversations, all the interventions that have happened in the last hour or so, they start from this premise that look, something fundamentally is altering in international relations. International order is collapsing. Multilateral institutions are not working, and in some ways, the assumptions on which we had underpinned a lot of geopolitics, a lot of our economic ordering, those assumptions are being questioned, right? We used to believe that if you trade among friends, if you trade, you become friends. Now the argument is let's trade among friends. So this is a big shift in the way we look at the economic architecture of the world and the global economic order. And I think that therefore, and all foreign policy, all strategic posturing is a product of its times. When we talk of Bandung spirit was a product of the world fragmenting at that point in time. Similarly, today, if India and Indonesia have to find a way of leveraging their economic resources, their economic talents, and their opportunities, it will have to be a product of our time. So we can all talk about the geopolitical reordering and geopolitical shift, but I think therein lies the opportunity. The opportunity is there because the geopolitical flux is so much that nations like India and Indonesia, which have been relatively inward-oriented, need to look beyond their peripheries. I think both India and Indonesia in some ways have been prisoners of their peripheries. I mean, Indonesia has not looked beyond Southeast Asia. India had also struggled to look beyond South Asia. I think the time for these nations now to look beyond their peripheries, to really respond to the challenge of our times, primarily looking at the Indo-Pacific, and you may want to use Asia, for example, use the word, whatever the term, but I think that this idea that we can all be satisfied with our own peripheries and we are all working together, I think that time is gone, because the geopolitical challenge that we are now facing also gives us this opportunity to come together and reflect anew as to what our aspirations are. And I think both India and Indonesia want to play a larger role. So therefore, this is the time when you need to look beyond, and the template is already there. The Indo-Pacific template allows you, I think, without India and Indonesia playing the kind of a role, without India and Indonesia growing on a sustained basis for the foreseeable future, at least for a decade or so, the Indo-Pacific construct itself would not come to fruition to its fullest capacity. So I think in some ways what we are talking about is looking at the present global order and situating India and Indonesia in that order and trying to reflect as to how we can bring the strengths of those countries together. A lot of the conversations that that the ambassador is making or the other experts are making are precisely that. So now comes the question, look, if the global order is fracturing, if there is a fragmentation, if when we are talking of trade among strategic partners, if we are talking of technology cooperation only among a select few countries, if we are talking of restructuring of supply chains at a time of great flux, economic flux, then what are the opportunities? And I think all of what we have heard is that both India and Indonesia are trying to respond in some ways to that aspiration. It is a slow process as of yet, but I think as both India and Indonesia think through some of the challenges that they face and respond to the global challenge, I think there is an intuitive understanding both on the basis of our historical and civilizational links, as well as this idea of both very independent actors on the global stage, not really reflective or not really responding well to others telling them what to do. I think there is a natural coherence here which perhaps can be tapped into, and that is what we have heard throughout, I think, the last hour or so. And I would just end by saying that if we can make the most of the present day challenge and convert them into some tangible opportunities, I think both India and Indonesia perhaps can respond to the challenge of our times, which is in their immediate peripheries, in ASEAN, in South Asia, but also then moving beyond in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's perhaps is the single most important challenge, because that's where the center of gravity of global politics and global economics has shifted.
Thank you. So we heard there's a lot of room to leverage these challenges and turn them around or turn them into opportunities for the future, right? So moving towards the future, like how can Professor Poppy, how can Indonesia and India work together to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals? As we heard earlier from Pak Dino, only around 12% of SDGs are on track for 2030, which is not too far away, just a little bit over 5 years, maybe 5 to 6 years from now. How do you think India and Indonesia can work together to, based on a model of SDG 2030?
Yeah, we heard earlier from the previous discussion that I think it's rather than very pessimistic regarding how these countries can achieve the SDGs. I think the discussion regarding the SDGs cannot be separated from the fact that what we have seen so far is the model of growth that has been implemented by many countries. We know that over the years we see the debate regarding the model of the growth, whether it's market-led or probably this is what we call as the state-led development. So mostly I think we have heard that what we learned, how to achieve the SDGs and how to achieve the development is basically giving the recipe that we have to follow the market-led growth, and in my opinion, probably that doesn't fit well with the Indian situation and Indonesian situations. Probably we can also think about, even though recently we heard the discussion how then to achieve the development through what we call as the Beijing Consensus, but probably that can also be modified. I think the idea behind the Beijing Consensus is the role of the government, which can be implemented by India and also Indonesia, that has been implemented somewhere else. However, the fact that the demographic situation and the social situation both in India and Indonesia cannot be just implemented the Beijing Consensus as per se, but it should be modified. And one of the aspects that we also have to learn from this kind of situation is the model of growth must be flexible and also adaptive to address the challenges of the current situation, and also it has to be embrace the innovation and sustainability. So that's why how to achieve the SDGs is also showing the commitment that both countries should implement the sustainable development and recognition that it is very important to see the interconnectedness between what we call as the economic growth, social well-being, and also environmental protection. Something that probably hasn't been thought when other countries have started their economic of development. Probably the target was only economic of growth. The target is only how to achieve certain sort of like income, but never been thought about how then that kind of process is also respecting the environmental protection and environmental issues, which this is the new thing, and then much harder for the developing countries like India and Indonesia to achieve certain stage of development, because it is not only about growth, but this is how then the growth it should be accompanied by the sustainable development and respecting with the environment. I guess that's my response.
So we heard, so hearing from you, that we keeping on to the theme perhaps of sustainability. All right, so Dr. Sofwan, like how, keeping in mind the commitment to the Paris Agreement, how can the two nations, sustain or turbo this double engine of growth without compromising on the climate goals?
Well, yes, Indonesia and India is facing this challenge of balancing environmental goals, which is now manifested in the Paris Agreement, and also the growth itself, because it is a developing countries. It is important to understand the context. Historically, the rise of environmental awareness and the integration of the environmental concerns in the development was pretty much coincided with the period of decolonization in the South. So the concern of environment is rising in the North, and decolonization is happening in the South. So these two trends are then collided and creating this situation in which developing countries need to manage the trade-off. And I think both Indonesia and India is in that challenge. To address this challenge, I think then it is important to look at at least two levels. First is at global level, because environment and development is not only something that is conditioned by internal condition, but also by the structural situation in which countries are developing. So it is important for India and Indonesia both to work together to create a situation in which structurally the global political economy is conducive to growth and sustainability for developing countries, including India and Indonesia. And I think that is a big challenge now, because when we ask developing countries like India and Indonesia to be committed to Paris Agreement, for example, the bigger players are not doing their part. The US is pulling out from Paris during Trump presidency, and it's the largest emitter. So a lot of demands for developing countries, but I think India and Indonesia could work together to consolidate the voices of the developing countries to demand more actual implementation of the commitments of the global North. I mean, the financing for adaptation and mitigation is still not delivered. The commitments for development financing is not delivered. So many of the commitments that is already agreed and committed by the developed countries are still not delivered, and the development financing gap is enlarging. The climate financing gap is still enlarging, and I think at that level, India and Indonesia must work together politically to consolidate the position of the developing countries, especially including the small island developing states, which would be affected significantly by the climate change. That's on the first level. On the second level, at the domestic development front, I think, as I mentioned previously, Indonesia can learn much from India in terms of energy transition. And if you want to have a more environmentally friendly and more sustainable economy, you need to intervene mostly in technology. I mean, emission is basically population times CO2 emission per person. CO2 emission per person is created by the size of economy and the technology. Size of economy, everyone wants to grow, so it's difficult to ask them to degrow. But so the way that we can get the development goal simultaneously with environmentally friendly is having stronger access to environmentally friendly technologies. And I think India is having things that Indonesia can learn and can work together on that. On the other hand, Indonesia is having a lot of natural resources in which, if that can be managed well, the impact on environment will be more positive to everyone. I mean, Indonesia is the largest producer of palm oil, and India is the largest consumer of palm oil. And Indonesia's largest emission is coming from deforestation, and many of these deforestation, the land use change is pretty much affected by the expansion of this agricultural industry. So if India, as the largest consumer, and Indonesia as the largest producer of palm oil, for example, this is only of a small sector, can work together to create a more sustainable palm oil governance without being dictated by those in the north, but developed together by the largest consumer and the largest producer, that would be a good contribution for the environment as well as for the development. Thank you.
Thank you. So, along the lines of sustainability, we've heard a lot about green, what I would term almost like a green growth, right? Areas that we're all very familiar with. We're here at this forum to discuss new ideas, the Blue Horizon. Ambassador Chakraborty, you also shared earlier about the seaweed farm here in Indonesia, I believe. Like, how do you see India and Indonesia working together to boost this blue economy, especially that the two nations share a very vast Bay of Bengal in between the two countries?
I would, before I get into that, I just wanted to make one point, taking forward what Sofyan was saying, which is that when we are developing and our goal is, or the way we want to develop is sustainable without hurting the environment. But another factor I think which is very common to Indonesia and India is that both India and Indonesia are trying to become developed countries in a democratic framework. I think that's very important to understand. The West became first rich and then democratic, whereas there are other countries in the world which are rich but not democratic. I think India and Indonesia are two shining examples of trying to manage these resource constraints in a democratic framework, which is not easy. Talking about green growth and blue horizons, I think as we want to develop without increasing our emissions, I think there has to be more focus on the oceans which surround it, on the Indian Ocean. There is a saying in India, I don't know if it is there in Indonesia, that we have somehow ignored our resources from the seas, from the ocean. And people say that the fish in Indonesia, in the Indian Ocean, are dying of old age, or they are being trawled by extra-regional powers. India and Indonesia, people of India and Indonesia are not eating the fish from our seas and from our ocean. So that's sad, because Indonesia is an archipelagic country. India is also a peninsular country, and we have ignored our seas and the ocean. And as the demand for food grows, as land moves, there is diversion of land from agriculture to urbanization. I think more and more we have to depend on the seas. And the demand is now not only on land, is not only for food, but also fuel. And I don't think our land can produce both food and fuel. So the fuel has to come from the seas. And I mentioned one example, but it's a very intriguing example, because the research was done by this company in India. It was a product of India's biotechnology startup ecosystem. But India doesn't have a maritime or a law which allows people to farm the seas. The question I ask everybody is, who owns the seas of India? If somebody wants to lease a piece of the sea, whom should one go to? Should one go to the central government or the state government? Who owns the seas of the coast of India? And happily, Indonesia has the answer. And here one can lease sea. And so we find this Indian company leasing sea here, producing wealth from the sea, and then selling it to global markets. So I think it's a fantastic example of the two countries working together. I would also like to say that you were mentioning about food and nutrition. So we all know that in Pa Prabowo's election manifesto, he had mentioned midday meal scheme. So immediately after his win, I was sent feelers by people here that they want to learn from the Indian experience. So already a team from Indonesia has been in India and gone and seen how the Indian model is working. And now we are trying to see if we can run a pilot of midday meal scheme. And they went to the kitchens, they went to the schools, they saw how the Indian model is working and how cost effective and efficient it has been. So we are trying to enter there, because nutrition is important again for SDGs. And my last point is that India has a Indian deep sea mission. Again, we are developing technologies, and we want to work with Indonesia. There are some research labs coming up in Indonesia. We want to partner there, and also technologies, ocean technology is being developed, and we want to partner with Indonesia. So great deal of interest in the maritime sphere. I am not talking of the traditional cooperation that is going up, the linkages between our companies and shipping and fishing, but I am seeing more and more interest of at least Indian corporate to work closely with Indonesia, because I find that the regulatory framework here is more suitable for companies to work on the oceans and the seas, and that's good for both countries.
Thank you, Ambassador. So, we've heard a lot, there's a lot of areas on focus for engine of growth for both nations, a lot of areas for cooperation. Professor Pant, how do you see this model of growth being adapted for the global south?
Thanks. And I think I'll take off from where the ambassador left in some ways, because, and I know clock is ticking, and you have, I think, some plans to take questions as well. But very, very briefly, 2 points. One on this, global south and what India and Indonesia are trying to do actually itself presents its, as an exemplar to, I think, a large part of the global south, that look, under very difficult circumstances, two democracies are trying to become, move from the developing curve to the developed curve. This is an extraordinary, I think, development. Never before in the history this has happened. So I think just by sheer being what we are, we can sort of enthuse a new level of commitment in the global south. But I think also, if you see what India and Indonesia have been able to do to put the global south back on the global map, if you will, I think that has been quite extraordinary, that the journey of the last 2-3 years in terms of how now everyone is quoting global south, from the Europeans to the Americans to Russians and the Chinese, everyone is talking. I mean, the journey started largely by the Indonesian leadership, and then India took over. I think this was something that Samir was mentioning earlier on. But I think this journey has now taken a life of its own. And I think that's where India and Indonesia's leadership becomes so much more critical and important, because we are doing this at a juncture when no one else was talking about it. And now that everyone is talking about it, we have to keep reinforcing this point that, look, this is not about great power politics. Ultimately, food, fuel, fertilizer, economic debt crises that the world is facing, those crises actually are impacting thousands and millions of individuals, and that means that the center of gravity of our conversations has to be the global south, where these multiple mutinies are unfolding.
Thank you, Professor Pant. I think we will now open for a few questions from the floor. If anyone has any questions for our panelists here, I am sure there's a lot of unanswered questions perhaps that someone would like to ask.
Good evening. My name is Ibtisam Al-Kitbi. I'm coming from UAE, and I'm a head of think tank called Emirates Policy Center. The idea of Indo-Pacific is mostly an American idea. It's just to surround China, right? So how both countries, India and Indonesia, get out of that, right? And to lead South Asia, to lead Asia, in fact, from that competition between the two giants.
No, see, I personally think that in some ways this is not an American idea. I think there is a lot of, when we have seen Indo-Pacific as a construct rise and now being adopted by so many of the regional states, there is an inherent logic to the argument of the Indo-Pacific that, and I think the original idea was ex-Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's idea that you cannot look at the changing balance of power in the Asia-Pacific without looking at India and what is happening in the Indian Ocean. And therefore, Indian and Pacific Oceans being one contiguous maritime zone was a reality that was almost staring us in our faces, and people were looking away from it. So I don't think it's a peculiarly American way of looking. I think it's a very, in some ways, it has given countries like India and Indonesia a very distinct voice in the global architecture, where one could have argued at one point in time only one voice was prevalent, and that was the Chinese voice. So I think now you see a multiplicity of voices where India and Indonesia can also now talk about this pan-Asian space and take ownership of that, and can provide also some solutions to the problems that have emerged as part of this geography. So I think looking at it more from a bottom-up approach perhaps allows us greater, and of course there are differences in the way India looks at the Indo-Pacific and the way Americans look at Indo-Pacific. So for India, the definition of the Indo-Pacific is from the eastern shores of Africa all the way to Oceania, which is different from what the Americans talk about. So I think there are differences there, there are nuances there, and perhaps the most important contribution that this logic of the Indo-Pacific has done, I think, is to give a greater sense of greater agency to a lot of individual stakeholders in this conversation, which were missing in the past.
Can I add something? I do believe that Indo-Pacific, as other terms, are politically contested and socially constructed. In fact, actually, the term Indo-Pacific was not issued first by the US or even by Shinzo Abe of Japan. The first use of Indo-Pacific was by the enemy of the United States. It's by Karl Haushofer. It's by Germany. Intellectual which used the term Indo-Pacific as the geographical imagination to contain China, to contain United States and the West Europe in that region. And US is now using that term. So what I would like to say is that if the US can use a term devised by Karl Haushofer, which is using that word to contain US and West Europe in the area that is then known as Indo-Pacific, why should we accept US imagination of Indo-Pacific as the single frame of reference? So I think that is why ASEAN is working and treating Indo-Pacific as something that can be socially constructed by proposing the idea of ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. And I think that is how countries like Indonesia and India can do. We should be the owner of the term Indo-Pacific. We are not the consumer of the term of Indo-Pacific. We should not be the passive receiver of the Indo-Pacific concept, but the main constructor of the idea of Indo-Pacific. So we should not let US, Japan, or China, or any other forces define what Indo-Pacific is. We are the ones who are in the heart of Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific relations was the connection which connects Indonesia and India. I mean, Indonesian culture, one of the largest is Javanese, is pretty much connected to India through the Indo-Pacific connection. Indonesian, the Javanese letter, the Honocaroko, is a legend said that it is connected to the arrival of a person named Aji Soko. Aji Soko is somebody which is, according to legends, coming from India. So our connections go through these centuries. Indo-Pacific connection, the confluence of the two seas, was already there before Abe made the speech, before the US issued the US Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think we need to ensure that the rightful owner of the term, which is Indo-Pacific, which is, I think, countries in the region, including Indonesia and India, should be the active creator of this term. We should be the norm entrepreneur. We should be the one who define what Indo-Pacific is.
Thank you so much. I think that is a very rich ending to our panel here, and perhaps the discussion and conversations can continue over dinner. I will now thank our panelists, our esteemed panelists, very rich conversation, and thank you very much.